They say blood is thicker than water. But sometimes, water is exactly what saves you from completely burning to the ground. Standing here in the warm afternoon sun, watching my husband laugh joyfully with his beautiful daughter, I can hardly believe this is actually my life. Just a few short years ago, I was standing in a crowded room full of my own flesh and blood, feeling completely, utterly invisible. A tragic punchline to their endless cruel jokes. It took the most humiliating, devastating moment of my entire existence to finally realize a profound truth. Sometimes, your real family are the kind strangers you meet in the darkest, coldest corners of your life. I am Whitney. To really truly understand how I ended up in this beautiful, peaceful backyard, you have to deeply understand the absolute nightmare I had to walk away from. A psychological nightmare cleverly disguised as a loving, supportive family gathering. For as long as I can possibly remember, my entire life was a constant, completely exhausting audition for my parents' affection. A desperate audition I was absolutely never going to win. My younger sister Vivian was the undeniable absolute golden child of our house. She was the one who did absolutely everything right, perfectly following their invisible, impossible rulebook. She went to the right conservative schools, she chose the right, safe profession as a highly respected veterinarian, she married Ryan, who was a wildly successful and charming surgeon, and now, she was expecting her very first baby. Everything Vivian did was an absolute masterpiece in my parents' eyes. A flawless, brilliant execution of the perfect American life. Me? I was just Whitney. I was the rebellious disappointment who moved to the chaotic streets of New York with absolutely nothing but a cheap sketchpad and a desperate, burning need to prove myself to them. Over the years I poured my blood, my sweat, and my endless tears into building a highly successful interior design firm from the absolute ground up. My trendy, wildly expensive loft apartment in the city center was my only true sanctuary. My hard work was featured in several well-known, prestigious design magazines. I was independently managing massive million-dollar budgets and fearlessly leading huge teams of elite contractors. But absolutely none of that mattered back home. To my parents, my demanding, thriving career was just a cute, temporary little hobby until I found a husband. I was always falling short simply because I wasn't Vivian. Psychology actually has a specific clinical term for this deeply toxic dynamic. It is called the family scapegoat. In the twisted, painful theater of our family dynamics, Vivian was the untouchable golden child. The fragile, perfect angel who could do absolutely no wrong. And I was the designated emotional dumping ground for all their unacknowledged insecurities. The permanent supporting character strictly meant to make the lead actress look infinitely better. The most dangerous, psychologically damaging part of this dynamic is how it completely strips you of your fundamental right to be hurt. If Vivian insulted my appearance or my choices, it was immediately brushed off as just a harmless family joke. I was constantly told I was way too sensitive, way too dramatic. If I ever dared to react or defend myself, I was instantly labeled the bitter, jealous sister maliciously ruining the family peace. I was strictly conditioned since childhood to silently swallow my pain, so they could easily maintain their perfect, flawless family illusion. I shouldn't have even been at that baby shower in Boise. That is the pathetic, heartbreaking irony of it all. I was in the middle of the most critical, stressful week of my entire career. I was actively managing a massive, high-stakes resort renovation on the West Coast, desperately juggling demanding contractors, severely delayed shipments, and brutal, unforgiving deadlines. But when the elegant, embossed invitation for Vivian's baby shower arrived in the mail, the desperate, unloved little girl inside me completely took over. I naively thought that maybe this time if I show up, if I make the ultimate effort, they will finally see my worth. So I booked a brutal, exhausting red-eye flight. I spent precious hours frantically researching and tracking down an incredibly expensive, top-of-the-line European baby stroller. I packed it carefully, surviving on a mere 3 hours of sleep and terrible airport coffee, stupidly believing that my massive sacrifice of time and energy would finally earn me a warm, genuine hug from my mother. When I finally pulled up to the posh, overly decorated country club venue in Boise, my hands were physically shaking. I had driven around the block 3 times just trying to calm my racing heart and practice my fake, agreeable smile. When I walked through the heavy wooden doors, my mother was waiting in the lobby. She didn't hug me. She didn't ask about my turbulent flight or my massive project. She immediately pointed an accusing finger at her gold watch and loudly criticized my timing, telling me I was always making things about myself. I lied and blamed the heavy traffic, forcibly swallowing the bitter, painful lump forming in my throat. Inside, the massive banquet hall was utterly suffocating. It was like stepping into a picture-perfect, pastel world that I was strictly forbidden from truly entering. Thousands of white lilies and baby's breath adorned every single corner, and a massive, ridiculous velvet banner welcomed baby Max. It was visually flawless, and entirely sickeningly fake. The moment I stepped further into the crowded room, the vicious family interrogation began. I was immediately bombarded with passive-aggressive questions about my personal life. Aunt Martha aggressively cornered me by the extravagant dessert table, her eyes scanning my tailored suit with profound pity, loudly asking why a pretty girl like me was still struggling so hard with her relationship status. She suggested that my aggressive career was intimidating men and keeping me from finding my real purpose as a mother. I smiled so hard my cheeks physically ached. I politely deflected with talk about my latest commercial design project, and I desperately managed to escape across the room to finally find my sister. When I reached Vivian, she was holding court on a massive velvet chair, surrounded by adoring friends. I nervously handed over my massive, carefully wrapped gift, the imported stroller that cost me a small fortune. I held my breath, desperately waiting for a smile, a simple thank you, anything. She barely glanced at the exquisite wrapping paper. She just muttered a lukewarm, highly dismissive response, clearly deeply annoyed that I had interrupted her captivating story, and she shoved the expensive box aside as if it were cheap drugstore lotion. The terrible baby shower games that followed only made me feel more deeply, painfully alienated. I sat there like a fish completely out of water, desperately trying to shrink into my chair. Dozens of women were passing around jars of baby food, sharing highly intimate motherhood memories, crying over ultrasound pictures, and I had absolutely nothing to contribute to the conversation. I was entirely invisible again. My older cousin Sarah leaned over the table and loudly offered to set me up with a severely balding, twice-divorced guy she knew from her local gym, loudly proclaiming that I shouldn't be too incredibly picky at my advancing age. I politely declined, staring intently at my lap, desperately wishing the polished hardwood floor would magically open up and swallow me whole. Then the true, inescapable nightmare finally began. The formal toasts. After several of her glamorous friends and my weeping mother spoke, showering Vivian with endless praise and dramatic tears, it was my unavoidable turn. I stood up, my legs trembling slightly under my designer skirt. I raised my crystal glass and gave a short, deeply sincere, and loving toast to her and Ryan, genuinely wishing them all the health and happiness in the world. I kept it completely classy. I kept it incredibly kind. I handed the silver microphone back to the host, foolishly thinking I had successfully survived the absolute worst of the afternoon. But Vivian wasn't finished asserting her dominance. Wearing this sweet, venomous, perfectly calculated smile, she aggressively snatched the microphone back from the host. She stood up slowly, looked right at me with eyes full of malice, and her voice echoed through the speakers. "Thank you so much, Whitney. You know, growing up, absolutely everyone always thought you would be the very first to get married and have beautiful kids. But here I am, completely beating you to the finish line. Honestly, with your terrible track record and your endless obsession with work, maybe you should seriously think about looking into some intense fertility treatments before it's entirely too late and your eggs dry up completely." The massive room went absolutely terrifyingly dead silent. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence where you can physically hear your own heart violently breaking in your chest. And then a few highly uncomfortable chuckles broke out. Then more chuckles erupted. My own flesh and blood. My aunts, my cousins, my parents. They were actually laughing at my devastating public humiliation. Many people might wonder how a highly successful CEO, a powerful woman who fearlessly commands entire boardrooms in New York City, could completely crumble over a bad, tasteless joke at a suburban party. It is a documented psychological phenomenon called trauma regression. In that crowded pastel room, I was no longer a wealthy, successful business owner. I was not the sophisticated woman whose designs were proudly displayed on glossy magazine covers. The absolute second those people laughed at my pain, my brain violently snapped back to being an unloved, helpless, desperate 10-year-old child again. All my worldly achievements, my money, my independence became completely meaningless, because deep down, I was still just a desperate kid holding up a useless trophy, begging for my parents to just look at me with pride. And when my mother chose to laugh along with the crowd instead of fiercely protecting me, my carefully constructed confidence completely and utterly disintegrated into dust. I couldn't breathe at all. My chest was incredibly tight, my vision violently blurred with hot stinging tears of pure shame. I muttered a quiet, frantic excuse to the woman sitting next to me and practically ran toward the large glass doors leading out to the private gardens. I stumbled outside into the fresh, cool air, desperately found a secluded stone bench hidden behind a massive oak tree, and I just broke down completely. I cried for the exhausting red-eye flight. I cried for the incredibly expensive gift she rejected. I cried for the loving sister I never really had. And I cried with agonizing grief for the mother who never once defended me. I was sitting there, violently shaking, furiously wiping ruined mascara off my burning cheeks, when a tiny, gentle voice completely broke the heavy silence. "Are you okay, pretty lady?" I snapped my head up, startled. Standing there in the sunlight was a little girl, maybe 5 years old, with a chaotic, beautiful halo of curly red hair and big, soulful brown eyes. She was holding a half-eaten chocolate chip cookie and looking at me with pure, unfiltered, innocent concern. Right behind her was a tall, handsome man, looking incredibly apologetic and rushing forward. This was Lily and her father, Nathan. Nathan rushed forward, apologizing profusely for his daughter's sudden intrusion into my private moment, but I quickly wiped my wet face and assured him it was perfectly fine. He reached into his tailored suit pocket and gently handed me a clean, crisp white handkerchief. He didn't ask why my makeup was ruined. He didn't ask why I was hiding. He just offered a quiet, solid, comforting presence. We started softly chatting. He mentioned that he was a friend of Ryan's from medical school, and that he had just recently moved his small family to the Boise area to start a new practice. He had bought an old historic Victorian house that needed a massive amount of renovation work, and he admitted he was completely overwhelmed by the daunting project. Lily's innocent, sweet questions about my sparkly shoes and Nathan's incredibly kind, non-judgmental nature were like a warm, heavy blanket thrown over my freezing, shivering soul. In just 15 short minutes, this total stranger and his sweet little girl made me feel more seen, more valued, and more beautifully human than my blood relatives had in 30 agonizing years. When Nathan learned that I was a professional interior designer, his kind eyes instantly lit up, and he genuinely asked if I could possibly help him look at some complicated floor plans. As we were about to head back inside the venue, Lily grabbed my hand, tugged it gently, and sweetly invited me to have a slice of chocolate cake with them at their table. I agreed, feeling a small, genuine smile finally return to my exhausted face. We walked back into the bright banquet hall together. When Vivian saw me walk in laughing with the handsome, highly successful new guest, her fake, glowing smile instantly faltered. She was clearly deeply, intensely annoyed that I was getting any positive attention whatsoever. She had only saved exactly 2 seats at their prestigious table for Nathan and Lily, subtly trying to socially exclude me, but Nathan politely pulled up a chair himself and firmly insisted I sit right next to him. During the cake cutting, sudden chaos struck. Lily, in her absolute excitement to reach the frosting, accidentally knocked over a large full glass of dark red fruit punch, right onto the hem of Vivian's incredibly expensive custom silk maternity dress. Vivian absolutely exploded with rage. She started shouting at the top of her lungs, making a massive, terrifying scene, aggressively glaring at the deeply terrified little girl who began to cry. Without thinking for a single second, I quickly took complete charge. I grabbed a thick stack of cloth napkins and a bottle of club soda, stepped right between Vivian's wrath and the trembling child, and I efficiently, expertly cleaned up the messy stain while speaking in a calm, highly soothing voice. I professionally assured Vivian the stain would completely wash out with professional dry cleaning, effortlessly diffusing the explosive tension instantly. Nathan stood there, tightly holding his crying daughter, looking at me with this profound, incredibly quiet respect. He was clearly utterly amazed by my fierce calmness in the face of my sister's highly irrational, toxic rage. As the exhausting party finally wound down and the guests started slowly leaving, Nathan turned to me. He politely asked if he could call me professionally to consult on his new house renovations. I was just about to reach into my purse to give him my business card. But before my fingers could even touch the paper, Vivian literally shoved herself physically between us. She grabbed Nathan aggressively by the arm, whisking him away under the completely ridiculous manufactured pretense of needing to discuss a highly urgent veterinary patient case with Ryan. It was so incredibly transparent, so deeply pathetic. But as Nathan was politely dragged away, Lily stayed behind for one quick second. She tugged on my dress hem, looked up at me with a huge smile and whispered, "My daddy really likes you. He wrote your pretty name on his hand with a pen, so he wouldn't forget it." I was still smiling warmly about that sweet confession when I went to the small back room to help my mother meticulously pack up the leftover expensive gifts. Suddenly, the heavy door flew open, and Vivian stormed in, cornering me against the wall. She slammed the door shut and aggressively accused me, screaming at the absolute top of her lungs, that I was deliberately trying to steal her spotlight. She viciously accused me of flirting aggressively with her husband's wealthy friend just to ruin her perfect special day because I was a bitter, lonely spinster. I was completely righteously furious. The deep injustice of it all finally boiled over, and we ended up in a massive, heated, screaming argument. I threw every single ounce of my pent-up frustration at her, calling out her cruel joke and her toxic narcissism. And then my mother violently intervened. Did she calm us down? Did she mediate fairly? No. She looked right at me, her face completely hard and devoid of maternal warmth, and she sided entirely with Vivian. As she always did. She is heavily pregnant, Whitney. How can you be so incredibly selfish and jealous on her special day? Just apologize to your sister right now and let it go. Something deep inside my soul finally permanently snapped. In that exact defining moment, looking at my own mother fiercely defending the daughter who had publicly, viciously humiliated me just an hour ago, I realized a profound, life-altering truth. People will constantly, shamelessly use the word family as a heavy, impenetrable shield to protect their own toxic behavior. They demand endless tolerance and infinite forgiveness simply because of shared DNA. But tolerance should only be reserved for those who actually respect your basic humanity. Family is supposed to be a two-way street. If you refuse to protect me when I am bleeding out on the floor, you do absolutely not have the right to demand my blind loyalty when it is convenient for your perfect image. Walking away from them right then wasn't a childish tantrum. It was the ultimate, necessary, powerful act of setting a permanent boundary. Giving up the false, desperate hope that my parents would ever love me the way they blindly loved Vivian felt exactly like a physical death. But it was a deeply necessary grief to finally heal. Saying no to their highly toxic environment was the loudest, strongest yes I had ever spoken to my own self-worth and dignity. I didn't owe them my warmth if it meant setting myself entirely on fire just to keep them comfortable. I dropped the heavy gift box I was holding. It hit the floor with a loud thud. I looked at my mother and my screaming sister. I shook my head with profound pity, and without saying another single word, I turned around and walked out the door. I walked out of the venue, I walked out of their toxic game, and I absolutely didn't look back. When I reached the dark parking lot, pulling my coat tight against the evening chill, I was fully expecting to get into my rental car completely alone and drive to the airport with a heavy heart. But standing there, leaning casually against his car under the streetlights, were Nathan and Lily. They were patiently waiting for me. Nathan took one long look at my exhausted, tear-stained face, opened his car door, and gently asked if I wanted to go get some sweet ice cream with them to end the night on a better note. I left my toxic family behind in that building, and I went to get ice cream. We sat in a small, brightly lit diner booth for hours. Nathan opened up and shared his heartbreaking story of losing his beloved wife to cancer when Lily was only 4 years old. I saw a man who deeply understood profound grief, who understood exactly what it meant to rebuild a completely shattered life from the burning ashes. We found we had an incredible, surprising amount in common, sharing the exact same core views on deep loyalty, hard work, and what a real safe home should actually feel like. Exactly a week later, Nathan called me in my New York office about his house renovations. Our highly professional calls about floor plans, load-bearing walls, and warm paint colors slowly, beautifully turned into hours of talking late into the night about absolutely everything else. The strict professional relationship gradually, naturally blossomed into a deeply romantic one. I found myself flying back to Boise every single weekend, not to seek validation from my broken family, but for him and Lily. 3 months after that terrible life-changing baby shower, Vivian gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Surprisingly, it was Nathan who gently encouraged me to visit her in the hospital. He held my hand and told me that holding on to deep anger is just drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I went. We had an incredibly honest, highly difficult conversation in that hospital room. It didn't magically fix everything, we didn't become best friends. But for the very first time in our entire lives, the toxic, unspoken spell of the golden child and the scapegoat was finally broken. We understood each other's firm boundaries, and they knew I would never tolerate disrespect again. As time beautifully passed, Nathan and I grew closer than I ever thought possible. Lily and I became completely inseparable, building a mother-daughter bond that felt infinitely stronger and purer than anything I had ever experienced with my own mother. And one beautiful sunny day, exactly a year later, in the very same beautiful country club garden where I had once sat crying alone and broken, Nathan got down on one knee. He proposed to me with the most beautiful sparkling ring I had ever seen. I looked at his kind eyes, and I looked at sweet Lily holding his hand with a huge smile, and I cried tears of absolute joy. Yes, of course I will. Now, as I look around at this wonderful, chaotic family gathering in our own backyard, I realize that sometimes the most painful, deeply humiliating moments of your life are just violent, necessary detours leading you exactly to the most beautiful destinations. I found my own true, authentic version of happiness. I didn't lose a family that tragic day at the baby shower. I simply left a toxic illusion behind and finally found the incredible courage to build a real one. Disclaimer: this video is created for the sole purpose of entertainment. All situations, characters, and stories in this video are fictional and are built entirely using artificial intelligence technology. We hope you have a relaxing time.